Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm your narrator Giles with a J and we're on Season 22, Family Annihilators Part 2. I already did a season of Family Annihilators years ago and you can check the description for a link to a playlist of all of those videos. Otherwise, on with the show. On November 14, 1974, the otherwise quiet village of Amityville, New York would be rocked to its core when it woke up to the news that 112 Ocean Avenue had become the scene of a grisly nightmare. It was a horror that no one who lived nearby would ever be able to forget, because it was there that the DeFeo family was massacred in their sleep. Obviously, there were a lot of questions in the immediate aftermath as to what had happened. What no one could have foreseen back then, though, was that it would spark an entire horror franchise, one known today as the Amityville Horror. In all of the excitement about demonic possessions and evil houses, it's often forgotten today that the real horror of the situation is a lot more rooted in reality. The reality that, before there were best-selling books and Hollywood movies, a man killed all of his family members in the house. This is Monsters. To the outside world, the DeFeos were pretty much a picture-perfect American family. After all, with the patriarch of the clan, Ronald, being a successful business owner, it wasn't like they were short of money. Through the car dealership he owned in Brooklyn, he had been able to give his family a very nice life, living out in a beautiful Dutch-style colonial house on Ocean Avenue in the village of Amityville, on the southern coast of Long Island. Ronald was always known for his booming presence and good sense of humor. Someone who could be very generous with both the people he employed and with his friends. When it came to his wife Louise, she was loved by pretty much everyone, with her gentle personality and her status as a doting homemaker making it nearly impossible to find anything to dislike about her. Then there were the 5 kids the couple had: Dawn, Allison, Mark, John, and Ronald Jr., who went by Butch. They were all embraced by the community too, even if Butch, the oldest, was known to be something of a troublemaker. While the youngest two, Mark and John, were still in their pre-teens and unable to cause too many issues, and while Dawn and Allison, both at different stages of their teens, were doing well at school, Butch was a slightly different case. Once he entered his 20s during the early 1970s, he started turning quite rebellious. He became known for his propensity for getting in bar fights after drinking too much. Of course, if it was just alcohol he was consuming to excess, it might not have been so bad. But that was far from the only substance Butch was abusing his body with as he started his 20s. No, just about any drug he could get his hands on would be used by the young man. It didn't matter if it was mescaline, LSD, or even heroin. If he could find it, he would abuse it. That, unsurprisingly, created quite a rift between him and his father after a while as, being a believer that drugs were a great evil upon society, and being someone who executed a tough love style of parenting, Ronald Sr. wasn't shy about being very hard on his son if he thought it would get him clean and straight. But that wouldn't happen in the end. The more Ronald argued with Butch about his lifestyle choices, the more Butch seemed to dig himself in deeper. He later argued that one of the reasons he ever turned to drugs in the first place was because his upbringing had been such a tough one emotionally. That's right, despite seeming like a picture-perfect family to the outside world, as is so often the case, things were very different behind closed doors in the DeFeo household. That's because, while Ronald could indeed be a very loving and generous man, he could also be a very intimidating and scary one too. That was a side his children would see frequently while they were growing up. It seems Butch, being the oldest son, was the one who got the brunt of that. That eventually led to the relationship he had with his father, a relationship which was hugely fractured come the 1970s. The relationship became so bad that it would create an atmosphere at 112 Ocean Avenue in which everyone living there was walking around on eggshells. While Butch was growing more and more depressive and disillusioned by the day, and while his father's anger towards him only seemed to get worse the more he used drugs and alcohol, the other 5 members of the household were having to try to deal with things in their own way as to not get dragged down by the situation. For Louise, the matriarch of the family, she would do that by turning towards her religion. She would often pray for peace between her husband and her son during her spare moments. Meanwhile, for the other 4 children, they just tried to avoid their oldest brother any time they could after a while, but that was often easier said than done. Come the mid-1970s, Butch had become such a difficult person to live with, it was impossible to escape his black cloud entirely if you were living under the same roof as him. It seemed like it should never have gotten to that point, though. After all, he had just about everything a young man could ask for, in that his family had status amongst the local community, and he didn't have to worry too much about things like money. But those kinds of outside positives don't always add up to a happy person inside. As a result of the insecurity he felt over his father's often cold parenting style, Butch ended up seeking validation elsewhere. And for him, that validation was something he found by living in a drug-fueled haze whenever possible. Eventually, his addiction got so severe it started to affect him at school, with Butch falling behind in classes and even finding it more difficult to interact with those around him on a social level. In early 1974, his friends had started to notice how disengaged he'd become emotionally, and how much he was beginning to fall apart physically, growing skinny and always seeming to have a far-off gaze in his eyes. Obviously, that only made things at home even worse, as by then the arguments between Butch and his father would often get so bad they would rattle the windows and cause the neighbors to wonder if everything was all right. It felt like the whole house at 112 Ocean Avenue had turned into a powder keg, one that only needed a spark in order to cause it to blow up in the worst way imaginable. Despite that, though, neither side seemed to be willing to budge when it came to finding common ground with the other. The more Ronald Sr. attempted to bring his boy back down to earth with tough love, doing things like forcing him to work at his car dealership part-time, the more Butch pulled away, to the point that he soon started stealing from that very car dealership, right under his father's nose. And that wasn't the only criminal activity he was getting involved in. At one point, Butch would allegedly pull a gun on a friend in anger, something he later tried to brush off as a joke. But no one around him thought those incidents were funny. No, they knew something was very wrong with the young man by then, as did he most likely. According to him, he was even hearing voices periodically, voices that told him to be careful because people within his own household were out to get him. At one point, he told a friend outright, quote, "Sometimes I feel like there's something inside me, like I'm not in control, like I could do something and not even care." Could that have been the start of some kind of drug-induced psychosis within Butch's mind? That's something that many have certainly speculated about in the years since. Of course, there were people who thought Butch was possessed by a demon, something that fueled the movies about the house in later years. Whatever was going on, it was clear he was reaching the point of no return. And as the summer of 1974 rolled around, there might still have been time to turn things around. But Ronald and Louise apparently had no interest in talking about their son's issues through therapy or anything like that, as to them it would have represented a public embarrassment and a sign that they had failed as parents. The stigma of mental illness in the past has fueled quite a few family annihilators. For as much as the DeFeos wanted to keep up appearances, it was no longer possible to hide all the tension building inside their home. Voices screaming, things breaking, those were common things to hear from the house by then. As one neighbor would put it, quote, "They used to fight like animals. We'd hear them nearly every week. Not arguing, fighting. Screaming at the top of their lungs. We always assumed the cops would show up, but they never did." Even when Louise reached her breaking point and finally decided that therapy might be the way forward for her son, Ronald Sr. would hear nothing of it. And that only allowed Butch to slip further into the paranoid drug-fueled mania which was very quickly consuming him entirely. Come October of 1974, even some of the few friends he had remaining were pulling away from him as they could see how deranged he was becoming, with him regularly talking about how those closest to him were plotting against him. And when he wasn't doing that, he was often stopping in mid-conversation and just staring into space vacantly for a while. At that point, Butch was no longer just erratic and paranoid. He was fully unreachable, with him talking in nonsensical slurred speech much of the time and causing everyone in his orbit to feel a sense of dread every time he arrived. Dawn DeFeo in particular became extra concerned about her brother once that happened. After all, as the second oldest in the family, she had been the closest to Butch for many years. But now things were so difficult, even she was scared to be around him. She told a friend, quote, "He talks to himself. He's getting worse. We try not to upset him, but it doesn't matter. He's always angry." That angry and paranoid behavior only intensified even further once Ronald threatened to cut his son off financially during a particularly tense argument one night. After that, Butch became obsessed with the idea his parents had hidden $200,000 in cash somewhere in the house, to the point that he would often confront his father about where it might be. Of course, whenever that happened though, Ronald brushed it off and told his son to worry about real issues like what he was going to do with his life. But unbeknownst to him, the idea that so much money was somewhere waiting to be found had already given Butch an idea of what his future entailed. If he could find it, then maybe he would have the freedom to go elsewhere and do as he pleased for a while. At the very least, it would give him the opportunity to put some distance between himself and his father. That distance was very much needed by the time November 12th arrived, as it was on that night that the verbal arguments between Ronald and Butch finally spilled over into a physical fight, which scared Louise so badly she actually called her sister afterward to tell her how concerned she was. The way she described it, there was something very wrong with her son, and she was worried that if something wasn't done about him soon, he could get to a point where he was completely beyond help. What Louise didn't realize at the time, though, was just how right she was, because that would be the last time she ever talked to her sister. It started around 2 a.m. on November 14th, 1974. That was when, after all the other members of the DeFeo family were sound asleep, Butch got up from his bed quietly. He hadn't been sleeping himself. No, he'd just been waiting quietly for the right moment to strike. Now that the moment had come, he walked over to the rifle case that he'd hidden in his room and pulled out a Marlin .35 caliber, the weapon he would use to carry out the annihilation of his family over the 15 or so minutes that followed. First, he walked across the hall to his parents' bedroom, taking light footsteps in order to avoid waking anyone up as he did. When he opened the door to their room, he found both laying on their stomachs, sound asleep, just as he'd hoped they'd be. That made things a lot easier for him to take the rifle in his hand, aim it at his father, and pull the trigger twice, shooting him in both the lower back and in the neck, with the first bullet tearing straight through his kidney and spine. Ronald Sr. died almost instantly. As Louise stirred, presumably from hearing the noise of the gunfire, she was shot once through the torso, with the bullet puncturing her lung and chest cavity, also killing her in seconds. Just like that, Ronald Jr. had murdered both his parents in cold blood, but that was far from the end of his rampage that night. Once Ronald Sr. and Louise were dealt with, the young man would next move to the bedroom of his two younger brothers, 12-year-old Mark and 9-year-old John, and somehow, once he got there, both of them would still be sound asleep. In fact, no one in the house had been woken up by the initial 3 gunshots, a curious detail which would baffle police for decades to come thereafter. It seems strange at first, but my son is a very heavy sleeper, and I could probably set off firecrackers in my bedroom and not wake him up. Or if it did, he would likely go right back to sleep. If the sound was sustained, it would be different, but 3 quick pops probably wouldn't be enough to wake him all the way up. Once in his brother's room, he shot Mark once through the chest and lung, killing him on the spot. Then, as the youngest John roused from his slumber, Butch shot him through the neck and spinal cord, giving him a quick exit from the world too. There was no struggle, no opportunity to fight back. Before the two preteens even had a chance to understand what might be happening, their lives were snuffed out by their own flesh and blood. All that was left to do was deal with the girls. Butch moved over to the bedroom where 18-year-old Dawn and 13-year-old Allison were still somehow sleeping and finished off his horrific task. For Allison, the bullet entered through her cheekbone and passed out the back of her head, easily being fatal. For Dawn, a bullet would enter through the back of her head, equally as deadly. That said, while everyone else was either asleep or stirring when they were shot, the position of Dawn's body when she was later found suggests she might have actually been fully awake when her end came. Some investigators thought she had actually been woken up by the sound of the gun and had, for a brief second at least, attempted to defend herself. Butch would later answer that theory with a shocking detail. Whatever happened with Dawn on that evening, though, the end result was the same. With the job over, Butch calmly went about the cleanup process. He started by taking a shower and then gathering up his bloody clothes and the weapon he'd used in the murders. He drove to a storm drain somewhere in Brooklyn and dumped the evidence. The whole thing had been carried out with chilling efficiency. And throughout it all, not even a neighbor was alerted to the idea that something may have happened. No, like with the family inside the house, it seemed no one in the area was woken up by the sound of gunshots that night. All one neighbor would claim to have heard was a dog barking at one point. Outside of that, though, everything seemed peaceful. That was particularly curious, as the rifle Butch had used should have had a deafening discharge, especially as there was no evidence he'd used a suppressor of any kind. But for some reason, that was the way things went. Once it was over and Butch had gotten done cleaning up the scene, he set about carrying out the second half of his plan. He got ready and headed to work as if nothing was wrong. Still employed by his father's car dealership, Butch arrived for his shift right on schedule on the morning of November 14th. While he was there, though, he made sure to lay the groundwork for what he planned to do later that evening. He made periodic calls to his family's home and made sure to sound a little distressed when he couldn't get anyone to answer. Basically, what he was doing was trying to give himself an alibi. After all, if he'd been seen by work colleagues calling home all day, blissfully unaware that anything was wrong, then in his mind that would write him off as a potential suspect. And after he was finished doing that, he felt comfortable enough to move on to the final stage of his plan. That was a stage that would be put into action once he left work that evening, and after allowing for a buffer period where he could have feasibly gone home to check on his folks, showed up at Henry's bar, his regular haunt when he liked to go drinking. On that night, though, he didn't have drinking on his mind. As soon as he walked through the doors of the bar, Butch would loudly proclaim, quote, "You gotta help me, I think my mother and father are shot." Needless to say, that caused everyone inside to turn their attention toward him in shock. From there, a convoy of people followed Butch back to 112 Ocean Avenue in order to confirm if the worst had indeed happened. Of course, Butch knew all too well what they were all going to find once they got there. After all, while he'd removed his bloody clothes from the scene as well as the murder weapon, he left all of his family members in the same beds they'd been murdered in earlier that morning. That was what the convoy found when they arrived at the house soon thereafter. And not knowing what else to do, one of them called the Suffolk County Police Department, who, upon learning of the situation, immediately sent a couple of officers over. When they made it to Ocean Avenue a few minutes later, they'd be met with the scene of the bar patrons all sitting on the lawn in shock, many of them crying. Butch was there too, that glassy-eyed stare of his gazing out into nothingness. As soon as he realized the cops were there, however, right away he was talking to them and giving his theories about what he believed had happened. His main theory was that the whole thing had been a mob hit. As he explained it, his father had connections within the world of organized crime on account of Ronald Sr.'s uncle being a captain in the Genovese crime family, and so Butch believed what had taken place that evening had something to do with that. It was the only thing that made sense to him, as he put it, with no other reason for the slaughter immediately available. The police asked Butch to come back to the station with them for some additional questioning. No one suspected him of committing the crime yet, of course. They just wanted to find out everything that he knew. That said, even at that early stage, it was noted that he didn't seem to be acting the way a man who had just found his entire family murdered would act. Sure, everyone grieves in their own way, but the fact Butch hadn't shed a single tear by the time he made it back to the station felt wrong to them. And then there were the details about his whereabouts the prior evening. Details that didn't seem to add up after a while. At one point, for example, he claimed he was at the house on the night of the 13th, and then later he changed that story and said he'd actually been out with friends instead. Really, there was just something odd about the tale he was telling and the alibi he was presenting for himself. And if it was indeed the work of a mafia hitman, as he continued to argue, why were there no signs of a break-in at the house? Honestly, the more Butch talked and the more things just didn't make sense. And that was far from the only part of the story that didn't make sense. Back at the scene, the forensics team were completely stumped when it came to answering the question of how no one had appeared to have woken up over the course of the murders. After all, it was clear based on their bodies that gunshot wounds had been the cause of death in every case. So how was it that no one had been roused from their slumber once the first, second, or even third blast happened? Had the family been drugged? That was the first natural assumption the investigators had, but toxicology reports would soon show that there were no obvious signs of sedatives in any of their bloodstreams. Truly, none of the details painted a picture of a logical sequence of events. One thing that did seem clear, though, was that whoever had killed the DeFeo family had to have done so on account of a personal motive. That would explain why none of the money or expensive jewelry in the house had been taken. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or anything like that. It was very clearly a cold-blooded and calculated murder. And that was something the investigators told Butch as they continued to interview him back at the station. But then he would agree with that as he was still pushing the idea that it had been a hitman. By then, though, police were doubting that claim more and more. When the times he told them he'd gone to work that morning didn't add up with the times given to them by colleagues, they began to wonder if he wasn't indeed hiding something. Then there was the fact that, by then, the coroner had been able to determine the DeFeos had died somewhere around 3 a.m. on the morning of the 14th, something that didn't match up with Butch's earlier claims that he had seen them alive and well before he went to work that day. So at that point, they asked him to remain at the station for the evening in a holding cell as they tried to get to the bottom of the murders. It was as they were leading him to his cell that he told them something that appeared to confirm their darkest fears. He said, quote, "Once I start talking, you're never going to believe what really happened." Obviously, that statement made the investigators believe that Butch really did have some involvement in what happened to his family. The next day, when questioning resumed, he was pushed even harder to admit what had happened. At one point, one of the officers said outright, quote, "You know what happened, don't you?" Then, seemingly realizing the jig was up, Butch decided to lay all of his cards out on the table by replying, quote, "It all started so fast." Butch began detailing how he had gone from room to room during the early hours of November 14th with a rifle in hand, picking off his family one by one until they were all dead. One curious thing he did allude to during his confession, however, was that Dawn may have known what he had planned ahead of time, and that she may not have been initially supposed to die. Outside of that, though, it was very clear the killings of the rest of the DeFeo family had been very intentional. As Butch would state when asked why he did it, quote, "I couldn't take it anymore. The yelling, the control. My old man was always on my back, like he owned me. Like I wasn't even a person. He'd beat me, threaten me, scream at me in front of people. I hated him." And the entire time he was telling police that, not a single tear would be shed. It seemed clear he felt no remorse at all for his actions. When asked if he felt guilty, Butch would outright tell police, quote, "They deserved it. You don't know what it was like in my house. My father was a bully. He made our lives hell. I did what I had to do." So, after making that known, he signed a full confession confirming everything he had said to the detectives that morning. Now feeling they knew the full truth about what had happened, the authorities formally charged Ronald DeFeo Jr. with 6 counts of murder in the first degree. Naturally, once the news got out to the local residents of Amityville, it left everyone in a state of shock. No one could quite believe that Butch, troubled as he clearly was, had been capable of such a horrific crime. Honestly, that a thing like that could happen in their quiet little village at all felt like an impossibility. But it had, and now the killer was going to be put in front of a jury of his peers in order to decide his punishment. Of course, his guilt was academic at that point. He signed a confession after all, but the reasons behind why Butch did what he did were still very much up for debate. And that was something his defense attorney William Weber knew all too well. In fact, that was exactly why he chose to go with the insanity defense. The way he saw it, with all the media fury surrounding the case, that was an opportunity to rewrite the narrative for his client. It was something that would hopefully see Butch get off a little easier as, if he wasn't in his right mind at the time he did what he did, then he couldn't really be held responsible for his actions. Meanwhile, as he was doing that, the lead prosecutor, Gerald Sullivan, was taking a different tactic. As far as he was concerned, there was no insanity at play when Butch had murdered his family. No, he knew perfectly well what he was doing at the time, and as a result needed to be held fully accountable for his crimes. So he presented to the court that the accused was nothing less than a cold-blooded murderer. All that was left was to see how well each side could get their arguments across. That quickly led to psychological experts being brought in to testify about Butch's mental state. Unfortunately, though, those experts would come up with mixed findings. That's right, while one in particular would argue that the accused either suffered from antisocial personality disorder or complex delusional disorder, conditions likely worsened by excessive drug use, another would state that there was no medical basis in which to suggest the defendant was not in his right mind at the point he killed his entire family. That left things at something of a stalemate, something that gave the media all the more to write about. And that wasn't the only part of the story the media were pushing strongly by then. On account of public interest in the case being so high, they published just about any theory explaining what had happened, no matter how outlandish it might have seemed. Sure, a mentally ill young man having a breakdown was a plausible story, as was a supposed mob hit, but things went to another level of speculation again when ideas of satanic cults and demonic possessions were thrown into the mix. To the people who believed that, the house itself had been a haunted evil presence, one which drove Butch to carry out a terrible crime. That said, those were not theories which were paid any mind in the courtroom. They were very much on the fringes of the conversation. Really, inside that room where the decision was being made on Butch's future, the whole thing hinged on whether or not he had been insane during the early hours of November 14th, 1974. According to the defense, it was easy to see how the accused could have been driven to the point of cracking given the family environment he was living in. It was a home filled with all the verbal and emotional abuse he'd put up with from his father over the years. In fact, they posited that it was a surprise he didn't break down sooner than he did. Really, he was a victim in the situation just as much as anyone else in their eyes. A damaged soul who was pushed to the brink and then sent flying straight over the edge through years of neglect and cruelty. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued to reassert their belief that none of it could have been carried out by a man who was in the throes of insanity, with forensics painting a picture of a very deliberate murder scenario and careful cleanup after the fact, as well as police records detailing an apparently well-prepared alibi of a mob hit being told to them the following evening. They argued all that proved Butch was very much in his right mind at the time of his crimes. The way they saw it, the oldest DeFeo son had done what he had with complete intentionality, and his reason for doing so was to get loose from under his father's thumb and regain control of his own life. If he killed his parents as they speculated, then in his mind that would make it easier for him to find the $200,000 that was supposedly hidden somewhere in the house. More than enough money for him to make a fresh start. Of course, in the process of doing that, he had to make sure his siblings were murdered too. if for no other reason than to tie up a loose end and stop them from overcomplicating things. Really, if Butch had any negative mental traits, it wasn't that he was insane. Rather, it was that he was a complete narcissist. So when he looked at his brothers and sisters that night, rather than see them as innocent, he saw them as worthwhile collateral damage in his ultimate plan. Countering that, however, the defense argued that the voices Butch had heard in the weeks and months leading up to the murders were clearly not something that would have happened with a mentally healthy person, nor were the paranoid delusions he was experiencing. His friends had confirmed that he had spoken to them about the voices and delusions. He had shown plenty of signs of psychological collapse prior to the massacre, with it being noted that for some time before that he was losing weight on account of him not eating. Yes, psychosis as they explained it didn't always follow a logical script. In fact, it was perfectly feasible that, even in a deranged state, Butch could have calmly carried out the murders that night, almost in a mechanical manner, and then cleaned up both the scene and himself in exactly the same way over the hours that followed. As William Weber put it to the court, quote, "It's easy to hate him, but hate doesn't answer the deeper question. What happens when a man can no longer tell the difference between love and threat? What happens when his own home becomes a battlefield inside his head?" While that might have won over some people in court, it did nothing to shift the opinion of the prosecution, as they responded not long after that, quote, "This is not the work of a man lost in fantasy. This is the work of a man who wanted what he believed was his, and when he couldn't get it, he eliminated everyone who stood in the way." That statement was soon backed up by an expert witness who was brought in around that time named Dr. Harold Zolan, someone who had a long history of examining both killers and the mentally ill. The way Dr. Zolan explained it, there was absolutely no evidence he could see that showed Butch was suffering from any kind of psychosis. Antisocial personality traits? Sure. Deep-seated narcissism? Almost certainly. But that wasn't enough to justify killing your whole family in cold blood. In his own words, as he gave them while he was on the stand being questioned, quote, "DeFeo was not under the influence to a degree that would cause hallucinations or delusions. He was lucid, calculated." As to what the jury thought of that, well, they seemed pretty split, with some sympathizing with the home life situation Butch must have had to endure while he was growing up, while others saw him as nothing more than a monster. That feeling for the latter was only added to by the fact that, throughout the entire trial, the accused had continued to remain silent, looking fully detached and emotionless in response to every detail that was unearthed. But he wasn't going to remain silent for much longer because eventually he took the stand himself. When that happened, he was forced to face questions designed to get to the bottom of why he did what he did. As Butch would tell the courtroom, his father was a bully who had made his life a living hell. And as a result of the mental anguish he put him through for years, the young man felt like he had no choice but to get rid of him so he can move on with his life. Of course, when it came to his mother and siblings, there was not the same level of bitterness. That didn't mean Butch was sorry about what had happened to them, though. No, he believed his mother was weak and his siblings were just stupid children. So for that reason, their deaths weren't a huge loss to the world. Really, if anything, he was doing everyone a favor by releasing them from the nothing life they had. Needless to say then, that was a shock for the court to hear, and it led the defense to question Butch about whether or not he felt he was insane at the time of his crimes. He responded by saying he may have been hearing voices when it happened, though he wasn't sure. With Butch's testimony over, the jury entered deliberations, something they took several days to do. In the end, the jury found that Ronald DeFeo Jr. was not insane and found him guilty on all 6 counts of murder in the first degree. Of course, as was par for the course at that point, Butch showed no emotion when the judgment was handed down. He continued to show no emotion when the judge sentenced him to 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life in prison. He was quietly taken from the court to Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Storm Haven, New York. But that wouldn't be the last anyone would hear from Butch, as he was already formulating a way to change the narrative so that he would still come off looking like a victim in the incident. It was only a few months later that he was telling a new tale to anyone who was willing to listen to him. In that version of events, he was not the lone killer in his family. No, as Butch would claim then, his sister Dawn actually had a role to play as well. In fact, she was actually the ringleader of the entire thing, with it being her who had come to her brother in the weeks leading up to the murders, trying to get him to join in on her plan to kill the rest of the family. As Butch told it though, he had refused to have any part of it, and at that point he felt that was the end of it. But then, in the early hours of the morning on November 14th, 1974, he was woken up by the sound of gunshots, and that was when he realized Dawn was actually going through with her plan. So he picked up his rifle and ran into his sister's room where, as he alleges, she had just killed Allison. Butch realized that he needed to stop her, so he shot and killed Dawn. Yes, in that version of the story, Ronald DeFeo had actually been the villain, and the only person Butch had killed was her, more as a means of self-defense than anything else. As to her motive, well, he argued that she had undergone some kind of mental breakdown. Of course, none of that was backed up by any evidence the police had been able to find. And so for that reason, the vast majority of people took the story with a massive grain of salt. Still, there were some who believed him. Many murderers, especially ones who receive a good deal of media attention, will end up with a small group of people who are convinced of their innocence despite there being no evidence. They will list all of the opinions that they claim prove the convicted's innocence, but there's never any actual evidence to back up those opinions. This case was no different, and soon conspiracy theorists were pushing the idea that Butch was in fact innocent. In the years that followed, numerous books and documentaries would continue to revisit the idea that Dawn was the real killer. To those who knew the girl, though, that was just her brother's way of trying to salvage his own legacy by throwing her under the bus in place of him. They saw no possibility that Dawn could have been involved, as they experienced nothing that would have suggested she was capable of such a thing. To them, that was her second murder, not of her physical body that time, but of her character instead. But that wasn't the only conspiracy theory that arose in the wake of the DeFeo murders. Others would push the idea of demonic possession being the reason Butch had committed the murders. That theory was able to gain even more traction when George and Kathy Lutz moved into the murder house soon after and had a terrifying experience of their own. According to their claims, 112 Ocean Avenue was the place where George would almost lose his mind on account of the spirits of an ancient Indian burial ground reaching out to him and trying to get him to kill his own family. Or at least that was what they led the public to believe. In truth, though, the events that have come to be known as the Amityville Horror have long been in serious doubt, with many arguing that the idea of a house where green slime dripped down the walls at random, or where a demonic pig creature named Jody was periodically seen, stank of opportunism. And it's hard not to see that argument when, after hiring Jay Anson to write a best-selling book on the experiences, the story would turn into a blockbuster movie franchise which has earned the family millions in royalties over the years. Even William Weber, Butch's defense attorney, has thrown cold water over the idea that the Lutz's experiences were genuine. In fact, he would go as far as to state that the whole story was something he personally cooked up with the couple over a bottle of wine one night. The reason, according to him at least, was because he saw a chance to build a legacy around the case that would make him richer than he could have ever imagined. In the end, though, it seems that George and Kathy Lutz ultimately chose to proceed without Weber's involvement, meaning he wouldn't get any of the money from the eventual book or movie franchise, and that was something he would end up suing them over. Of course, they fought the suit and his claims that the whole story was made up. No, they would argue until the day they died that the haunting they'd experienced in Amityville was real, and that the meeting they had with William Weber after the fact was only to discuss tying that into the story of the DeFeo family to create a larger myth around the house. In the end, that was what happened, regardless of whether Weber remained involved or not. Today, the Amityville Horror is one of the most iconic stories in modern American history. Ironically, though, the actual murders have become something of a footnote to the alleged hauntings that came after. Really, when people think of Amityville today, they're far more likely to think of the Lutzes than the DeFeos, and that means something has been lost in all of the drama around demons and dark spirits. The fact that the real horror was 6 people being murdered in cold blood by the person they should have been able to trust the most. For all his flaws, Ronald DeFeo Sr. was a man who didn't deserve to die the way he did. He was a complicated figure, one largely shaped by the tough time period he grew up in. And when it came to Louise DeFeo, she was just trying to hold her family together as best she could within the confines a woman was expected to live within during that time period. And of course, Butch's siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John, could have all had bright futures ahead of them. But because of what happened, none of those futures ever got a chance to come to pass. As for Butch, well, while he would have a future, it would be one spent entirely behind bars. When it finally came to an end on March 12, 2021, when he died at 69 years old as a result of complications related to a heart issue, there would be no fanfare, no big news story reporting his passing. No, instead the moment would pass without much coverage, as by then the general public had largely forgotten he was even part of the larger Amityville myth. No one would publicly collect his body. No funeral service would be held. It all just came and went as if a monster had never walked through his home in the early morning hours of November 14, 1974 and slaughtered his entire family. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.